And what's your pleasure?
From the Thomaston Place Auction Galleries in Thomaston, Maine, I'm Elizabeth McLeod with Auction Waves.
32,500, 100,000 there. Players all over the house, 400,000 on this rare piece, and 600,000, 900,000, 1 million, 1,175 once, 100 million, 175 twice. We all good? Sold.
Art can be serious. Art can be deep, dark, and meaningful. But art can also be fun. And the art that's the most fun is the art that helps you find that inner joy that came the first time you learned you could make it yourself. On this edition of Auction Waves, we'll meet an artist who built a career holding on to that joy. But first, the latest auction news. Here at Thomaston Place Auction Galleries, we're feeling our own inner joy as we put the final touches on the 2025 Autumn Majestic Auction, a 4-day spectacular with very literally something for everyone. Of particular note, day one of this sale presents a unique series of lots that we're very proud and very privileged to offer. An historic and intact collection of Civil War artifacts from the estate of a single Union soldier. Benjamin Goodwin, a farmer's son from Stetson, Maine, fought at Gettysburg, saw Abraham Lincoln in the flesh, and proudly displayed important relics of his military days in his Waterville home until his passing in 1920. That collection remained in the hands of his descendants for over a century. And we are privileged to offer these items for the consideration and the respect of discerning collectors. You can learn more about Benjamin Goodwin and his distinguished wartime career in a special essay entitled A Soldier's Life, and you can review the actual items he cherished to the end of his days at our website, thomastonauction.com. This is Auction Waves, and I'm Elizabeth McLeod. When you visit our Thomaston galleries to preview items in the Autumn Majestic Auction, they're among the first items that you'll see. 3 whimsical wooden figures on display stands, with all the creative vigor of historic New England folk art. But you might be surprised to learn that all 3 of these figures are the work of a trained contemporary artist, who for many years operated his own studio and workshop down the road in Belfast. Harvey Peterson lives in South Carolina now, but he's happy to join us today to discuss his work and the creative philosophy behind it. Thanks for joining us today, and to start off, give us a bit of personal background, if you would. What was it that brought you to Belfast?
Well, I spent my summers since I was a year old on Deer Isle down in Stonington. My parents, my grandparents, my parents had a place down there that they built, and I was very fortunate to spend my early summers starting, I guess it was in 1960. And then when I got into high school, I had to start working summers, and then the folks started renting the place, but we always had our 2 weeks there at the end of the summer. And then as time went on, I went to school in Baltimore, graduated from the Maryland Institute, both undergraduate and graduate, and ended up teaching in Baltimore at a couple of different, St. Paul's School for Girls, the Bryn Mawr School, and ended up for 19 years at the Gilman School, a boys' prep school in Baltimore. But what that did is it gave me my summers off. And I reached a point after too many hot, humid, sweltering summers in Baltimore. I thought, gee, I could spend my summers in Maine if I had a place to crash. I was also at that time growing tired of Baltimore City, the crime, the congestion, the hustle bustle. And I was getting a little tired of not so much teaching, but the politics of the school. We got a new headmaster. And my then wife, now ex-wife, she didn't take to Baltimore. So she said, why don't you move here? Here meaning Deer Isle and Maine. And I said, well, I finally was able to come to that decision, but I couldn't live on Deer Isle 12 months of the year. It was just too remote. And she knew Belfast. So we bought a house in Belfast and we kind of wintered there and summered over on Deer Isle. And it worked well until my wife and I decided our marriage wasn't working. We got divorced. I kept the house in Belfast. She kept her house in Deer Isle. And having left the teaching career, I had to figure out how I was going to make a living. And I didn't particularly want to go back to teaching. And I had painted all my life. Ever since I was in early high school, I was painting. When I made that changeover, I also was in the midst of a change in my work where I had developed a real fascination and interest in folk art. So I learned a lot about woodworking and realized how much I enjoyed it. And I thought, well, before I left teaching, I had tried to start collecting folk art, but I was too late. It was getting too expensive. The things I was interested in were kind of out of my price range. So I thought, well, to heck with it, I'll make my own. And started with kind of little figures, and they've begun to grow. So at any rate, that's what brought me to Maine. That's what brought me to Belfast.
Well, we've been looking over your figures, and they've been getting a lot of positive notice from people who come through the gallery.
Right.
They walk by and the attention is just riveted. They see them standing there and they're like, oh, and there's just something that's just really inviting about these characters that you've built. And I can't resist playing with them. One of the figures of yours that we have in this auction is equipped with an actual ventriloquist figure's moving jaw, the same like you would do with an actual dummy.
Yeah.
And when I'm showing this to people, I can't resist doing an act. How you doing? Good to see you. Glad you came out to see. I do that. And did you intend when you made that figure for people to interact with it that way?
I don't know if that was so much the intent, but I've always, since I've been working in this vein, always liked ventriloquist figures, the carvings, the construction. Also, the challenge of, well, how do they do the lower jaw? The operation of it? There was a book that came out a number of years ago, Rico and Maresca. It had beautiful folk art, but there were ventriloquist figures in that I kind of were inspiration. But it was the challenge of trying to figure out the mechanics and how I could do that. I wanted to get that lower jaw working like a ventriloquist jaw, but I didn't think so much about, somebody's going to want to play with this. And yet, as you're describing your experience, I'm thinking, that's fun. I'm glad you enjoyed.
And I think it's intriguing that you've left the mechanism exposed. I mean, there's that opening in the middle, and you can see the stick where you move the head, and the ring with the cord to move the jaw. And most people who've seen a ventriloquist act have never seen that. They don't know how the figure works, which is part of the fun, the mystery of it, is how is he doing that? You've exposed that in this figure, and it kind of demystifies the experience and makes it more accessible, I think. Right. And I think that's a fascinating thing to do with a figure like this.
One of the things that I've been interested from early on with this folk art inspired work was the duality of the interior and the exterior. And early on, some of the early figures, they needed to have a kind of a function. And so I put clockworks within the torso or whatever, and was working materials around that. But it kind of gave them a raison d'etre, if you will. In other words, these are folk figures, but they're clocks. Right. There's a purpose. And I remember a discussion with John Ames early on, and John kind of said, well, you keep doing these clocks. And we talked about it. He said, Harv, they don't have to be functional. your work is interesting enough, you don't need to have a function as part of it. And there was something very freeing in that. And it opened up, I guess, other possibilities.
Well, it kind of strikes me as being like, the way that you could show a child a very carefully programmed toy that's designed to be and do and represent a certain thing. And you can give that same child a shoebox. And the child will probably have more fun with the shoebox than with the toy because she's going to come up with her own idea of what the box is. And that's sort of the way that these figures work for me. It's they're a trigger to imagination in the way that a puppet would be.
Yeah.
And there's a very thin line between figures like this and puppetry, I think. I think you could probably make them into marionettes without a lot of effort.
Although I never was compelled to go in that direction. Yeah, they are very puppet-like and very doll-like. And in fact, there were people that said, "Oh, are you still making dolls?" And I said, "Well, I'm making sculpture and they're doll-like, but they're not dolls." And, "Oh, well, they look like puppets." No, they're not puppets. They're figures. And as I said earlier, they grew out of a fascination with folk art. I think Samuel Robb, the guy that in New York that did the carved Indians for the tobacco shops, which were some of my earliest memories of figurative folk sculpture. And I always loved those. But this book that really was instrumental in kind of getting me on my way had lots of other kinds of figures, and some of them were commercially derived or functioned commercially as advertising. And that has always been kind of an ancillary interest of mine. But also scarecrows as another example. Figurative, again, functional, and yet the possibilities are incredible with what you can do with that idea.
Now, I remember the Maine of my childhood. You would go out on a drive on a Sunday afternoon and you would pass all these little roadside shops that would have different types of wooden figures, whirligigs and little, people that you'd put in your garden. And they would be all like, cut out of old box crates and things like that, and painted. Right. Were you influenced by things like that?
Oh, very much so. I had a dear friend in Baltimore who's no longer with us, but he was my closest friend down there, and he was an artist. He made furniture from found materials, and his whole thing was he would scavenge throughout the city in Baltimore downtown. He would go into abandoned row houses and take out boards and molding and this, that, and the other, and he had a warehouse where he stored this stuff and used it to make his furniture. And he and I would go out on expeditions looking for materials. And that sparked, some of my fondest memories are of finding and discovering some of this stuff.
I think one of the things that people find most appealing about that sort of art is that it is completely unself-conscious. I think that the person who is making that art is not thinking, I am making art. They're thinking, I am making this neat little thing to put in a garden.
Right.
Is there a point, you think, where a trained artist such as yourself can transition over into doing authentic folk art unself-consciously? Do you think that can happen? Because I sense a real sincerity in your work that I don't always pick up from pastiche work.
I appreciate that. I never considered it in that vein, never thought of sincerity. While I was making it, I was very conscious of trying to access that childlike, that innocent, that self-taught outsider, trying to access that, and at the same time knowing full well I've had way too much training.
You can never escape your inner child.
No. Thinking back to my education, I can remember an English professor I had at school who, one of our end of the year term papers was dealing with the interior journey of the artist versus the exterior journey. And I remember at the time banging my head against the wall thinking, I don't understand this. I don't know what he's after. I don't. But as I stewed over this and as I was reading the required readings and the elective readings, and it finally came to me that there's this kind of duality, and to access that part of you that is innocent, childlike, etc. But I'm a grown adult and I'm trying to make a living at this, and I'm trying to make a business of this for 15 years, I think it was.
Another thing that I really like about your figures is the found materials. I mean, I was looking at your dowser. We have the man who's holding the divining rod, and his clothing is made up out of specification prints from Bethlehem steel, and then a map of Maine. What suggested using those specific items? Did you just happen to have these lying around and decide to use them, or did you find them and wait until you had just the right idea for a figure?
Well, a little bit of both. I don't know if you're familiar with Liberty Tool. I assume.
Oh, yeah. I know Liberty Tool.
But I was a very regular devotee of Liberty Tool and would just regularly go out and scavenge for materials that spoke to me. And I rarely, as it is with places like that, you can't go into those places with an idea that I'm going to get this, because they might not have it. You got to go in and find what they have and see what you can use. And Liberty Tool was a wonderful source, but I'll never forget the day going in there and finding there was an envelope that was full of blueprints from one of the best steel plants, and had all the specification, the blueprint, the color, the idea of blueprints, because that's a dated,
right.
They don't do those anymore.
Correct.
But I always loved blueprints. When I was doing the dowser, and I had the idea kind of to start with, but now I'm trying to figure, okay, I'm going to open these blueprints and start to use them. And I tried not to get precious with materials, but I also wanted to save them for the right application. It was a matter that the material is what I was excited about. The maps on the dowser, and if I'm not mistaken, those maps are from an old gazetteer, an old gazetteer.
I thought they looked familiar.
Well, that's about place, and that's what dowsing is. It's about place. It was looking at the topography, the ledge structure, and there was no magic to it. But I still like the idea of that folk aspect to dowsing that I particularly liked. I liked the little glass case that was part of the base. That was as close as I could come to suggesting water.
Now, the third figure that we have is the aviator. He has very impressive articulated wings that you can flap. The thing that I notice about him is he has his hat down over his face and his eyes are covered and he can't see where he's going. Is he flying, or does he think he's flying, or is he going to fall? What do you think he's doing?
My idea was he was flying, and I didn't realize, I have done a few figures over the years. I kind of got the idea I was after, but in that case, and I have a figure here in my permanent collection where it was a woman who was tipping her hat, but getting the arm and the hand and the head and everything. It was a cross between tipping her hat and sucking her thumb. And it was my clumsiness. And I've had other pieces where, I thought I had it, but I didn't. But I thought, oh, well, that's part of the kind of cruder, innocent. It's not perfect. And I certainly didn't want the pieces aspire to perfection. But the aviator, I thought I had him working where he was, but I think, as I recall, and I guess seeing it in the JPEG, oh, yeah, he was looking more down.
What tells me that he's probably just getting off the ground is the position of his legs. And he's looking down to see if he's going to hit that tree. But there is just enough uncertainty there that you can read that any number of ways. And I think that that's that's a point where you start to really get into, interpretive art. Authorial intent does not come into play here. It's like,
Right,
what does the viewer take away from the piece? And I think
right,
that this is a
right.
really good example of that.
And I think part of the nature of the uncertainty of flight, I think, comes into play. And again, the material aspect of that, I loved building those wings that while I was teaching, one of my favorite projects that I would give the kids was they had to learn how to do isometric projections,
Mhm.
and they ended up having to build wooden models of one thing or another, whether it was a house or a tool or whatever it was, and it changed from one year to the next. But I realized how much I enjoyed, and it was almost like that the idea of as a child building balsa wood planes
Mhm.
and cutting and gluing and fabricating this kind of framework. And I really like the framework, and the wings are muslin covered.
Which is what they used on airplanes.
Right? Oh, right.
And they would tighten it up with nitrate lacquer to kind of shrink it and tighten it. And when I was looking at the figure, I mean, I've seen a couple of World War I planes up close, and I looked at it and says, that's real familiar. And I was very impressed that you had used that technique because it gave it
Right.
this real sense of period authenticity, which is
Right.
something that I always like to see.
Well, as I've been talking about materials, there's a vocabulary, if you will, of materials. There were certain materials that resonated with what I was doing.
What work are you working on now? What is your current artistic thrust?
I haven't done, and I don't imagine doing any more of the folk inspired sculpture. Part of that is the studio that I had up in Northport was a great studio that I had built with a friend, and it worked out very nicely. But when it came time to pack that up, and I ended up giving some materials and giving some tools away, and I thought, I can't replicate that here. So if I'm going to do work, I think I'm going to have to shift into reverse, go back to painting, and I'm continually looking for subject matter, for ideas. And then I had a workshop at school that was a printmaking workshop involving monoprints, and I wasn't familiar with that, but I was looking for a way to incorporate printmaking into my curriculum where I was teaching. And yet I didn't have a lot of training. We didn't have a press, but I thought, gee, this monoprint business works very nicely because you don't need a press, you can burnish. And when I started working with the guys on that, they gravitated right toward it. I mean, they really got a kick out of it and did some lovely work. But I was got very inspired. I loved the immediacy of it. Part of my problem with my watercolors earlier on, they were pretty tight, not the loose flowing, but pretty specific. And they started taking too long, and I missed that kind of immediacy. And when I discovered the monoprint process, I realized the immediacy is built in. I had to do these paintings, and they were, probably 16 by 16, 18 by 18. But I had to do a painting within an hour, or the paint would set up to the point where it wouldn't transfer to the paper. Okay, there's a time frame built in. So I had to work loosely and freely and not detailed, and found that it was surprising how much they ended up looking like watercolors because they were on paper and they had a transparency that even though they were oil paint, I was using a fair amount of terps. So they were somewhat transparent, but they ended up having a kind of directness and boldness that I was after.
Well, I hope that we will get to see some of those works, perhaps when you pass through this area next summer
Yeah.
on your way to Liberty Tool Company.
Right.
Art does have many forms, from fine to folk and back again, and we thank Harvey Peterson for making that journey with us today. And no matter what your own taste in art might happen to be, we've got something you'll like in our 4-day Autumn Majestic Auction, coming your way November 6th through November 9th. Join us for live previews at the galleries, 51 Atlantic Highway in Thomaston, Maine, beginning on November 1st. And explore the full catalog, no matter where you are, at thomastonauction.com. Tishri Dobson, as always, is at the piano. Dave Allen motivates the guitar, and the entire program is written and edited for you by yours truly, Elizabeth McLeod, who wishes you smooth sailing and happy bidding for Auction Waves. Auction Waves is an exclusive presentation of Thomaston Place Auction Galleries in Thomaston, Maine.